Hello. Last week we looked at Sartre's account of the emotions, where Sartre argues that the emotions are essentially a way for us to organise our practical relationship with the world with what he calls a magical organisation of the world. So we resort to a magical relationship to the world or an emotional relationship when our normal practical engagements with the world become too difficult to maintain. Now, we're not going to be discussing this fact in too much detail today, but it's worth noting that Sartre develops a very, very similar assessment of the imagination. So he argues that the imagination can also be used as a way of achieving things that we can't achieve in practical terms because they're too difficult. So Sartre writes the following about the imagination, and I'm just including it really because it ticks back to what we were talking about last week. So he says, "The act of imagination, as we've just seen, is a magical act. It is an incantation destined to make the object of one's thought, the thing one desires, appear in such a way that one can take possession of it. There is always in that act something of the imperious and the infantile, a refusal to take account of distance and difficulties. Thus the very young child, from his bed, acts on the world by orders and prayers. Objects obey these orders of consciousness, they appear, but they have a very particular mode of existence that I will try to describe." Okay, so we're going to look at the imagination today and see how this works in terms of Sartre's account. Now, I gave you 3 different sections on of Sartre's work on the imagination to look at for this week's topic, and they relate to the kind of topics I want to cover in the lecture. So each of those 3 sections is one of the sections I really want to talk about in this lecture. So I want to begin by looking at Sartre's account of criticisms of traditional models of the imagination. So I'm going to focus here on Descartes and Hume and a little bit of Leibniz as well, simply because they're figures you should be familiar with. But if you read the rest of the imagination by Sartre, you'll see that Sartre's criticisms of later psychologists raise many of the same objections that he's raising here against Descartes and Hume. So he thinks that these problems aren't resolved as we move through the tradition. So as you'll see, once again, Sartre's claim is going to be that we need to understand thinking and imagining as ways of relating to the world, not as things that are going on inside our heads, much as emotions were ways of relating to the world. Now, the second part of the lecture, I want to look at some of the key features of Sartre's distinction between conceptual relations, perceptual relations, and imaginative relations to objects. Now, what Sartre is going to argue is each of these different ways of relating has a structure that's different in kind from the others. So we can tell whether something is an imaginative relation to an object or a perceptual relation by the way in which the object kind of discloses itself to us. Now, having looked at that, I want to then turn to the conclusion of the imaginary. Really because here Sartre starts to move from what's so far been a kind of discussion of psychology to a more existential discussion of the way in which we constitute the world. Now, the notion of the imagination is going to fall away when we get to Being and Nothingness. He's not really going to be talking about the imagination anymore. But we'll see in the next few weeks that Being and Nothingness borrows very, very heavily from these structures that are first brought into play through the imagination. Okay, so Sartre publishes 2 early works on the imagination. So the first of these is translated into English as The Imagination, and the second is translated into English as The Imaginary. Now, the first of these is kind of like a historical account of the development of theories of the imagination. Whereas the second is Sartre's more positive account of the imagination itself. And Sartre originally saw these two as being parts of one work called The Image. So these two books were going to be one text, but the original publisher was only really interested in the historical study, so chose to publish that part. So what I want to do, first of all, is look at the reasons why Sartre believes that traditional models of the imagination have really failed to give a proper place to the role of the image in our mental lives. Now, Sartre argues that we tend to naturally suffer from an illusion when we think about the imagination. So here's what he says about this. He says, existence as imaged is a mode of being quite difficult to grasp. Grasping it requires some straining of the mind, but above all, it requires us to get rid of our almost unbreakable habit of construing all modes of existence on the model of physical existence. So we tend to see ideas as if they were physical things. And the result of this kind of misunderstanding is we tend to also understand the image of a thing as kind of like an inferior form of that thing that's within our minds. You know, like a copy, but an inferior copy. So when I close my eyes and bring to mind the image of the lecture notes that I'm looking at here, then we're guided in a sense by a natural illusion that the image in my mind has the same kinds of properties as the object itself, and that it exists in a similar way to the object, but maybe in an inferior way. So Sartre sums up this as follows. He says, pure a priori theory made a thing out of an image, but internal intuition teaches us that the image is not the thing. The data of intuition are thus going to be incorporated in the theoretical construction under a new form. The image is a thing, just as much as the thing it is an image of. But by the very fact that it's an image, it receives a sort of metaphysical inferiority in comparison with the thing it represents. In a word, the image is a lesser thing. So, if we see the imagination as relating to objects within consciousness, then, which is this kind of illusory model, then Sartre is going to argue that we're going to find a number of problems. So for Sartre, once imagining is taken to be the production of images within our mind, then there are essentially three basic ways in which we can understand the relationship between thinking and imagining. And these are kind of archetypally expressed for Sartre by the philosophy of Descartes, the philosophy of Hume, and then the philosophy of Leibniz. Now, what he's going to say essentially is that we can either see images or the imagination and thought as separate from each other. That's what happens in Descartes. We can see thought itself simply as a movement of images. That's the kind of empiricist model of Hume. Or we can see images or imagining as a confused presentation of what is a kind of rational structure of thinking. Now, in each case, Sartre is arguing that by taking thinking and imagining to just involve different kinds of images or different kinds of objects in our minds, we're ultimately unable to explain how we can distinguish or relate together imagination and perception. Okay, so I'll go through these now. I'll go through Descartes, Hume, and a bit of the Leibniz to just give you a sense of what Sartre is talking about. Okay, so you guys should mainly know the Descartes. And for Descartes, the distinction between, or division between the imagination and thought is bound up with his division between the body and the mind. So images, or the imagination, all of those structures are essentially bodily structures. So here's a quote from Descartes. The difference between this mode of thinking of the imagination and pure understanding may simply be this. When the mind understands, it in some way turns towards itself and inspects one of the ideas which are within it. But when it imagines, it turns towards the body and looks at something in the body which conforms to an idea understood by the mind or perceived by the senses. So thinking relates to the mind, imagining relates to things that are going on in the body. Now, there are a number of really important consequences if we take this view for understanding the relationship between imagination and thinking. First of all, if images have their origin in the body and are then translated into the mind, then for the mind there's going to be no straightforward way of distinguishing between products of the imagination and products of the senses, because both of those come to the mind through the body. Now that leads Descartes, as you know, to the claim that there are no kind of certain marks that distinguish, for instance, between sense data that we receive when we're asleep and sense data we receive when we're awake. You know, we can't distinguish between imaginary sense data from dreams and real sense data from when we're awake. Second, there's going to be a radical break between thinking and imagining. So Sartre says that for Descartes, in order to think, for thinking to be possible, material images have to be translated into this immaterial realm of the brain. So he says, the motions of the brain caused by external objects, although they do not resemble the latter, awaken ideas in the soul. The ideas do not come from the motions, they are innate in man. The motions are like signs that provoke feelings in the soul. Now what that means is that for Descartes we've got essentially two processes in the mind, according to Sartre. So there's the kind of the normative process of reason, you know, the process of judging and evaluating. And then there's a causal process of the generation of images by the nerves and by the body. So as he says, Descartes posits both image and thought without image. Now on Sartre's reading, therefore, what we find in Descartes is there's a leap between the imagination and thinking. So even when we do use images and diagrams to work through a problem, as Sartre says, the only function of these images is to prepare the mind to make the conversion to imageless thought. So if the body simply produces signs that move the soul, then there's a strong sense in which we never really relate to the world at all. And everything we can think is pre-given by the kind of the collection of signs that we can recognise within our mind prior to our body's engagement with the world. So for Descartes, there's therefore no account possible of where ideas come from and no genuine encounter with the world. So as such, the categorical nature of our understanding of the world, our understanding of the world in terms of judgment, is established prior to any engagement with it. Okay, so those are the kind of problems we find in Descartes. There's a kind of an inability to explain the genesis of thinking, and there's also a radical separation between us and the world, because we can only understand the world in terms of signs that predate our encounter with it. Okay. Oh, there we go. Okay, so one way to overcome this sharp distinction between thinking and images is to follow Hume in reducing all thinking to the association of ideas. And that removes Descartes' category of imageless thought. You know, so we solve the problem of there being a gap between the imagination and thinking by simply just removing the idea that there can be thinking without images. So that's what Hume does. So for Hume, ideas are simply copies of impressions, and that gives us a very simple account of the way our ideas have their genesis and experience. But there are a number of problems with this model too. So first, as Sartre notes, Hume has real difficulty explaining abstract thought. So that's a really easy thing for Descartes to explain. But for Hume, all thinking occurs within images. And because of that, it's difficult to explain how we arrive at thoughts that relate to things that don't have a kind of concrete nature. But it's also the case that for Hume, thinking ultimately is just going to be a causal sequence of images, one after another. Now, if that's the case, it's difficult even to talk about images being true or false, because all they are images that are brought into consciousness by a previous image. So as well as having no abstract thought, it seems like we don't really have an account in Hume of true or false thoughts. We simply have a causal sequence of one thought after another. Second, if ideas and impressions simply differ in degree, then it's going to become impossible to really distinguish ideas and impressions. And we'll come back to this in a minute. And then finally, as Sartre notes, Hume effectively reduces the mind to a realm of objects that are brought to consciousness through laws of association. But in doing so, he's unable to really explain why any of these objects in particular have the focus of attention over any other. If all the mind is a causally connected series of bundles of impressions, why is it that some of those impressions are the objects of attention and some of them are not? So he says, they are always present in the mind, however they are not always perceived. Why? And how does the fact of their being pulled by a given force to a conscious idea confer upon them a conscious character? So there's a problem with Hume in terms of how we explain why out of this causal bundle of the self, certain ideas at any moment are conscious ideas and certain ideas are unconscious ideas, given all the self is a set of causally interrelated impressions and ideas. Okay, so I want to talk briefly about Leibniz, as I say, and Leibniz is the third way of reconciling these moments, the image and thinking, for Sartre. Rather than posit a sharp divide between thought and images, or equating them directly as Hume does, Leibniz essentially argues that images or the imagination is a confused perception of our normal processes of thinking that operate in terms of judgment and all those other things. So in effect, if we were God, we wouldn't perceive a world of space and time and we wouldn't imagine images. We would simply have a sort of thought without images. But because we're finite beings and we're limited, we're forced to present what essentially are conceptual relations in perceptual terms. So here's a quick quote from his correspondence with Clarke over the nature of space and time. So he says, as for my own opinion, I have said more than once that I hold space to be something purely relative, as time is, that I hold it to be an order of coexistences, as time is an order of successions. For space denotes, in terms of possibility, an order of things that exist at the same time, considered as existing together, without entering into their particular manners of existing. When many things are seen together, one consciously perceives this order of things amongst themselves. So what Leibniz is arguing there essentially is that space and time and perception are just ways of perceiving a kind of conceptual ordering of objects for a finite being that can't perceive that ordering clearly and distinctly. So space and time are ways that finite beings relate to conceptual relations that are far too complicated for us to gather. Now, I don't want to go into too much detail into what Sartre thinks is wrong with this, but he argues that Leibniz, in a sense, introduces a panlogicism. So the idea that everything can be understood in logical categories, that means that Leibniz can't really explain the kind of the brute existence of qualities that we find in the world and in perception. Okay, so that's the range of solutions, according to Sartre, that we can use to understand the relationship between thinking and the imagination once we've accepted this idea that the image is like a thing inside our heads. So either we see it as separate from thought, or we see thinking as essentially a manipulation of images, or we reduce the image to a confused form of thinking. So those are the ways in which we can understand the relation between thinking and imagination once we've assumed that thoughts and ideas and impressions and images are all just things within the brain. Now, in the imagination, Sartre presents two contradictions that he thinks emerge from treating thought as the manipulation of images within consciousness. First, Sartre notes that once images are understood as passive objects within consciousness, we can't understand their characteristic distinctness from perception. So we intuitively know that there's a difference in kind between images and perceptions, for instance, between what you imagine to be the case and what you perceive to be the case. But if we take this kind of immanentist view where these things are internal objects, we end up being able to posit only a probable distinction between ideas and perceptions. So Hume, for instance, argues that the distinction between an idea and an impression is the relative liveliness of each. So ideas are kind of less lively, more pale versions of the impressions we receive from the outside. Now, that only gives a probable way of distinguishing between ideas and impressions. So as Sartre puts it, why doesn't the image of the noise of a cannon blast appear like a weak but real creaking? Now, once again, Sartre really notes here that what the problem is that not that we only have a probable account of the distinction between perceptions and images, but that this is phenomenologically false. Because in reality, when we imagine and when we perceive, we have a certainty about whether we're imagining or perceiving. So the problem isn't that Hume's account only gives us a probabilistic account, and so it's going to be wrong on some occasions. The problem is that Hume makes something a question of like weighing up the chances of something being this thing or that thing, whereas in fact phenomenologically we know that we can immediately distinction with certainty between something perceived and something that's imagined. So as Sartre says, at each instant there arises around us a multitude of strange little incidents, objects that move by themselves in appearance, that creak and groan, appear or disappear. All these fantastic events are explained upon reflection in the simplest way in the world, but at first pass they should surprise us. We should be, at least for an instant, tempted to rank them amongst images. So, the world's full of moments where things are ambiguous, where things happen, where we see flickers of movement. And if the immanentist account is right, then because there's an evaluation about whether something's an image or perception, we should be constantly surprised and constantly shifting between seeing something as a perception and an act of imagining. And in reality, we're not. We recognise that there's a kind of ambiguity to perception itself. Okay. Second, Sartre points to a difficulty in explaining the relationship of thinking to images. So if we can only explain our body's relationship to the world of objects, we can only explain our body's relationship to the world of objects by treating it as an object in itself. So as he says, if I can lift this book or this cup, it's insofar as I am an organism, that to say, a body is subject to the same laws of inertia. Similarly, if we're going to view the mind as a kind of mechanical system, a system of associations of ideas, for instance, we likewise leave no place for the idea of a spontaneous subject that's going to differ from the objects of thought that it manipulates. So in rejecting the notion of the self, therefore, Sartre argues that Hume is perfectly logical and that his system must be accepted or rejected en bloc. Okay. So that's Sartre's account of the problems with previous models of imagining. So what I want to do for the rest of the lecture is go through his positive account and set out what the structure of his view of the difference is between images and perceptions, and then look at some of the existential implications of this account he's putting forward. So he says at the outset that All or almost all have made the confusion indicated above between the identity of essence and the identity of existence. So what's this confusion he's talking about? Well, ultimately it rests on seeing images and objects as contents of consciousness. So we see images as things that consciousness relates to in the same way that it relates to sense data. And once we do that, there's a natural move to claim that images have the same kind of ontological status as perceptions. So if we see both of these things as objects within the mind, we're going to see them as the same kinds of things. So the mistake arises when we don't recognise that the imagination isn't something that relates to things like images within a consciousness. Rather, what imagining is, or imaging as Sartre calls it sometimes, is a way that consciousness is able to relate to an object that's absent. So as Sartre puts it in the imaginary, to be able to imagine an object is not to have an image of that object, but to have a rule by which we can intend towards that object. So in effect, therefore, perceiving and imagining an object, these aren't two different objects of the same nature within our mind, but these are two different acts of different natures that relate to the same object. So imagining and perceiving are both relations to things, but they're relations that operate in different ways. So Sartre gives this example of turning my head away from the paper in front of me to fix it on the grey wallpaper in my office. And he argues that when I do this, I can still relate to the piece of paper I was looking at before, but I do so through my imagination rather than through perception. So he says, the sheet that appears to me at this moment has an identity of essence with that sheet I was looking at earlier. And by essence, I intend not only the structure, but also the individuality. So when I look at the paper, I'm relating to this paper through perception. And when I look out of the window, but I kind of imagine the paper, it's the same paper that my act of imagination is relating to, but through a different act of consciousness. It's not that we have two objects. The sense datum that's in my head of my looking at the paper and the imagination idea that I have when I'm thinking of it. We have the same object related to in two different ways. So the heart of this claim is going to be therefore this radical translation or transformation in our understanding of what consciousness is. So we don't see consciousness anymore as a kind of manipulation of ideas within the brain. We now view consciousness as relating to objects in the world. Now Sartre defines 4 characteristics of the image that form the basis for his way of distinguishing it from perception. Now the first is that the image is not something within consciousness, but rather is a process by which we relate to something that's outside of consciousness. So as I've just been saying, in this regard, perception and imaging, as well as thinking of an object, can all share the same object, even though the way that we synthesize our relationship to the object is going to be different in each of those cases. So here's Sartre's way of making this point. When I perceive a chair, it would be absurd to say that the chair is in my perception. My perception is, in accordance with the terminology that we have adopted, a certain consciousness, and the chair is the object of that consciousness. Now, I close my eyes and I produce the image of the chair that I have just perceived. The chair, now being given as imaged, can no more enter into consciousness than previously. An image of a chair is not and cannot be a chair. Actually, whether I perceive or imagine this straw-bottomed chair on which I sit, it always remains outside of consciousness. In both cases, it is there in space in that room in front of the desk. Now this is above all what reflection teaches us. Whether I perceive or imagine that chair, the object of my perception and of my image are identical. It is that straw-bottomed chair on which I sit. It is simply that consciousness is related to this same chair in two different ways. Okay, so that's the first characteristic, that imagination and perception are two different ways of relating to the same thing. Okay, the second characteristic is what Sartre calls quasi-observation. So perception and imagination both relate to objects. And the imagination essentially relates to the object as absent. Now, this mode of relation is fundamentally different from perception. And Sartre notes, for instance, that we can't know anything new about an imagined object by observing it. But perception, for instance, instead constantly overflows our cognition of the object. So Kearney nicely characterises, I think, the three different ways of intending towards an object that Sartre discusses as follows. So the percept, and this is a perception obviously, is a progressive complex of different real presentation. To perceive a cube is to present it gradually and exactly from all sides. The concept is a single and simultaneous knowledge of the conceived. To conceive a whole cube is to know all of its determinations, length, breadth, width, height, weight, etc. The image, though simultaneous like a concept and presentative like the percept, differs in both in that it fails to provide an exact apprehension of the object intended. So you can see here that Sartre is starting to develop his account of how we can distinguish between perception and imagination, and it's going to be because the object itself is presented in a fundamentally different way. So when we intend towards an object of perception, when we perceive something, we can note, as he puts it, that the object of perception constantly overflows consciousness. So the object of perception, its nature, is given by the infinity of relations it holds to things around it. Now, a consequence of this is that in perception, as Sartre says, one must learn objects as they unfold. You know, if you want to find out about something, you have to watch it develop in time. Now, that means the distinguishing feature of perception is that we have to live perception. Now, in contrast, the imagination operates purely in terms of the knowledge I have of something as I construct the image of it. So Sartre says, for instance, if I imagine the Pantheon and I attempt to count the number of pillars that it has, I can only do so if I already know that number in advance. So no amount of scrutinising my mental image of the Pantheon is going to add to my knowledge. In a similar manner, in contrast to perception, mental images don't require any kind of spatial or temporal context. So the smile of Pierre that I present to myself at this moment is neither the smile of yesterday evening nor his smile of this morning. It is no longer a case of a concept, but of an irreal object that gathers in an invariable synthesis the diverse smiles that have endured and disappeared. So when I imagine Pierre smiling, I'm not imagining Pierre smiling at a particular point in time. I'm imagining a kind of Pierre smiling outside of all particular contexts, if that makes sense. Now, finally, whereas perception relates consciousness to the full duration of an object, the image is given all at once. So the reason is that the imaged object is complete. So as Sartre says, I know where I'm going and what I want to produce. To this extent, even when the image we're thinking of is an image where it's an image of movement, it's always viewed in retrospect and in a sense from the point of view of the movement's completion. Whereas perception, obviously, we have to wait for a movement to unfold in time. Okay, so the third characteristic of the imagination is that it posits its object as a nothingness, Sartre puts it. So perception relates to an object that's present to us, and imagination takes one of four forms instead. As Sartre says, it can posit an object as non-existent, or as absent, or as existing elsewhere. It can also neutralise itself, that is, not posit its object as existent. So in taking nothingness to be a characteristic feature of imaging, and being to be a characteristic feature of perception, Sartre's setting up a radical dichotomy between these two relations to the object. In a sense, each opens out onto a different world. So when I say that I've got an image of Pierre, I'm not meaning that I don't see Pierre, but rather that I don't see anything at all. So there's a radical difference between the way we relate to the world in terms of perception, which operates in terms of being, and imagination that operates in terms of nothingness. And that's really going to be at the heart of Sartre's account of being and nothingness, obviously. But this dichotomy between the two modes is going to be fundamental. Okay, the final characteristic of the imagining consciousness is that whereas perception is felt to be something passively undertaken, imagining carries with it a certain spontaneity. So when I imagine a cube, for instance, I'm free to manipulate it. I can change the way it's perceived, the faces, I can spin it around in a way that I choose. But when I perceive a cube, I need to wait for my perception to see different perspectives on it. Okay, so that's the first bit of the imaginary, the second part of the reading I gave you. So what Sartre's done there is he's shown how imagining relates to objects outside of consciousness. And this solves the issue that Descartes has about a lack of encounter with the world. And it also solves Hume's problem of Hume being unable to explain attention. Now, in holding that perception and imagination relate to the world in different ways, he also solves this problem of explaining why we don't infer a difference between imagining and perceiving, but we recognise it immediately and with certainty. Okay. All right, well, I just want to conclude really by talking about Sartre's kind of existential reading of the imagination in this early work. Now, in the postscript to the imaginary, Sartre sets out a much broader role for the imagination within his philosophy, and I think what he's doing here is he's setting out the centrality for it that will become apparent in his later work, Being and Nothingness. So when he's concluding the imaginary, Sartre starts asking about the relationship between imagination and consciousness. So he asks, what must consciousness in general be if it is true that the constitution of images is always possible? So how must consciousness be and relate to the world if we're going to be able to imagine things about the world itself? So that involves asking a further question about whether imagination is what Sartre calls a contingent enrichment of consciousness, or whether it's an integral function of consciousness's functioning. Now, as Sartre notes, there's no special problem about the imagination within the kind of the illusion of immanence, within these immanent models where everything is going on within consciousness. So images and perceptions, if they just differ within the psyche for these models, then we don't have a problem of how they relate internally, but we have a problem about how we relate these psychic objects to objects in the external world. Now, for Sartre, as he puts it, the type of existence of the imaged object insofar as it's imaged differs in nature from the type of existence of the object grasped as real. So when we imagine an object and when we perceive it, we're imagining and perceiving an object under two different aspects. So we need to explain how it is that imagining an object in the world and perceiving an object in the world can be related together. Now, when we looked at the different characteristics of imagining just now, we saw that in various ways to imagine an object is to posit it as absent. Now, positing something as absent is to create a kind of rupture in the real world. So Sartre gives the example of looking at a portrait as a portrait. So not focusing on the paint and the canvas, but seeing within the portrait the image of what it's a portrayal of. Now, in that situation, Sartre argues, the figure portrayed in the portrait is portrayed as kind of beyond the world. So I guess we talked about this in terms of nausea in the record. If I change the illumination in the room in which the portrait is situated, for instance, I don't change the illumination of the figure in the portrait. You know, the canvas may look different, but the figure in the portrait is illuminated in the same way they were before. So the illumination is something set by the artist, not by us. And he writes, similarly, if the picture burns, it's not Charles VIII as imaged that burns, but simply the material object that serves as what he calls an analogon for the imaged object. Now, there are 2 points that are important here. Sartre's claim is that in order to be able to posit something that's outside of the real world, consciousness must be able to step back from the world itself. If we can't withdraw from the real, as Sartre puts it, consciousness could therefore contain only real modifications provoked by real actions, and all imagination would be prohibited to it, precisely to the extent that it was bogged down in the real. So I think we can give a gloss to what Sartre is talking about here by noting that consciousness isn't supposed to be understood for Sartre as something that coincides with its objects, but is a way of relating towards them. Now, that's the central claim about what intentionality is, and it's the imagination that allows consciousness to put a distance between itself and the kind of stream of perceptions and representations that it's relating to in terms of the object. So the imagination, in bringing in this moment of absence, separates us from the causal sequences of perceptions and brings that spontaneity to consciousness that is fundamental to it, and also introduces what Sartre calls the irreal into the world. So that's the first moment. So second, this stepping back requires that our action of negation operates in relation to the world. So it has to be situated and in response to a particular characteristic of things. As such, the irreal object, this object of imagination, is dependent on the world in the same way that a painting requires a canvas and paint in order to show what's being portrayed. Now, in fact, Sartre notes that there are several consequences to this view that the annihilating nature of consciousness. He argues that, first of all, in stepping back from the world, we constitute the world as a totality against consciousness. So as he puts it, if we can use a comparison, it's precisely in putting themselves at a convenient distance from their paintings that the Impressionist painters bring out the whole forest or white water lilies from the multitude of little strokes that they have placed on the canvas. So as we'll see, Sartre's claim is essentially that in taking up the real, we constitute it as more than merely a set of objects, but as a world that has a meaning and has a sense. And to this extent, the annihilating power of consciousness requires us not simply to step back from the world, but in stepping back, we give significance to the way in which objects are related to each other. So there's a double movement related to this move to introducing this irreal object into the world. First of all, the real is constituted as a totality through the process of stepping back from it, and then the irreal object is posited in relation to this totality. So in the imaginary, this process is a process of constitution that's rather schematically worked out, this question of how these two are related. And there are lots of questions that are unanswered about how negation and absence relates to a world of plurality and what this totalizing means. But as we'll see when we turn to Being and Nothingness next week, this is really going to be the heart of Sartre's positive theory. This idea that consciousness operates by adding a moment of negation into the world. Okay, so that's it for this week. What we're going to do next week is we're going to move on to look at Sartre's major work, Being and Nothingness itself, and we're going to see that many of the issues we've been looking at so far, so the role of the irreal in organising the world, the contingency of experience, of existence rather, and the use of emotions to prevent us from engaging with difficult situations. All of these are going to play an important role in Sartre's characterisation of the human condition as a whole. So we'll see that all of these themes that we've been working at so far combine to really develop the essential premises of the existential approach to the human condition. Okay, thanks a lot.